So let's just get into, who you are, a little bit about your background. I mean, I could read your bio, but who wants to do that, right? Because it doesn't always give all the great information, but just a little bit about who Melissa is.
Sure. I'm Melissa Guller. I'm the founder of Wit Wire. And in my business, I help mostly women who have their own online businesses start podcasts so they can become more visible, build their brand, and ultimately build their business, sharing something that they really love. And I got into podcasting after working for years in the education tech space. I worked for Teachable. I worked for a fairly large course creator, New York Times seller named Ramit Sethi. And I think just that unique viewpoint on the online business space, having seen people use Teachable's platform, working behind the scenes for a big course creator, and now being a business owner myself has really helped me not only build my own business, but help others do the same.
Right. So working with Teachable, I mean, that was the first platform before I even started going to Kajabi that allowed me to just get started online as far as with courses. And back then, courses were not the thing. Most people, obviously the times have changed. But so if you've gotten some like real inside scoop to provide, have you seen good Teachable users and bad? Tell us a little bit about that.
It varies so much because I think a misconception about the online business world, I think there are quite a few, but I think a lot of people assume it's only like very markety, very pyramid scheme-y, or even I would say nowadays there's a lot of, coaches talking about coaching, and there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. But working for Teachable, you really got to see just the diversity of people teaching skills as wide-ranging as watercolor painting, drone flying. This guy plays the handpan. It's this giant drum that looks like a UFO. You really can build a business online, teaching and sharing your knowledge about any topic, no matter how much of a hobby or a small topic it may feel. There is a market, I really believe, for everything. And I would say, too, it's not that the most successful creators found a brand new topic that had never been done before. And certainly there are many successful courses on marketing. I think that's a good example. But what differentiates the successful creators is that they have a unique perspective. It's just who they are. Like, it's their point of view, it's their personality, it's their background. It's not that they invented a brand new way of marketing. And people really resonate, I think, with real humans who they feel like they can relate to. So I just think that this misconception, like it's too crowded or you can't start a business because somebody else is doing that, prevents a lot of really wonderful people with a really important voice from getting into business.
That is the perfect segue, because we wanted to get into, is it too crowded to start a podcast? Like, so sometimes in some of my conversations when I'm working with women, they're like, I want to do a podcast, but someone's doing that topic already. So, I mean, should I do it? How can I do it? Is it too late? Is it crowded in the market to even get going with the podcast?
I love this question. I'm, of course, asked all the time. And I think it's because podcasting is so buzzy right now, which is great. Everybody's talking about podcasting. I used to joke that everyone and her mom had a podcast, but now it's pretty literally true. But the thing with podcasting is there are only 2 million podcasts, which sounds like a huge number at first, but there are 600 million blogs. So once you put that into perspective, it starts to feel a lot smaller. The industry is still growing. It's still very new, only started in 2004 compared to the rest of the internet. That's when podcasting became a term. And if you do look around, I think we're all kind of in our own worlds, inundated by information that is familiar. Like if you are an expert in gardening, you're surrounded by people talking probably about gardening. So it feels like everyone knows all of these topics. But the truth is there are so many people who still need to learn the skill that you have, the business offer that you can share. And I think from both angles, is it too crowded from a numbers perspective? The answer is no, it's still a very small space. And is there still room for you? I would say the answer is definitely yes. As we talked about before, you'll have your own spin, you'll have your own kind of unique reasons for getting into gardening, or your tone or your personality or just kind of your vibe. So I firmly believe that there is space for everyone. And in fact, if there's competition, I really believe it validates demand. It's telling you that other people want to hear about gardening. Right. So to me, that says that's a green light. That's actually a good sign.
So when starting a podcast, what type of budget should someone have? And if it's a low budget, that's typically what I hear. I work with a lot of women that are actually working right now, and they're trying to create their budget as far as where I'm going to start, what program am I going to do, how I'm going to build this business. What type of budget should one have?
So important. I think that you could start a podcast for a much lower dollar amount than people think. The non-negotiable to me is a microphone. You don't have to buy the most expensive microphone, but the good news about the mic as well is that any content you want to create for the internet, whether it's today a podcast, tomorrow even doing a live workshop over Zoom or an online course, like any form of putting your knowledge online, YouTube videos, the microphone will help because people will forgive very casual video backgrounds. They'll forgive a lot of things, but bad audio that sounds like you're over like a really crackly bad phone call, people will just go so far in the other direction in less than a couple of seconds. And it just doesn't put your best foot forward. And you can get a mic from a starting point of even $50 or $60 one time for a mic. I would say that the average mic that people might start with is between like $50 and $100, and that'll last you for a few years. So to me, that's the thing I would spend money on. If it was only one thing for the podcast, absolutely the microphone. And then after that, there are other options when it comes to producing episodes. So to record audio, there are free softwares, free tools you can use. Same thing with editing. There are some that I like. My favorite tool happens to be called Hindenburg. It's $90 one time. So it's not an annual recurring fee. So that's a tool I would recommend, but there are free tools like Audacity. You can edit for free. And then there's something called hosting. If you imagine your audio files for each episode, they're each, as you well know, they're little MP3 files. And so they have to live somewhere on the internet. They can't just magically get into somebody's iPhone and listening on Apple. So the hosting platform puts all of those files into one place and then shares them with all of the listening apps, Apple, Spotify, etc. So you can host, again, for free with a tool called Anchor, or there are paid tools where to me the benefit is mostly that you get better analytics, you get better information, sometimes ease of use. But across all of those tools, there is always a free option. So to me, it really just comes down to spend on the microphone and then do what you have to do for the rest.
Got you. So before launching, how should that plan process work? So let's go back to the example of gardening. You know I want to use this platform to talk about my business. So how do I plan that launch for my podcast?
To me, I used to work in big marketing teams and manage a lot of course launches. And I always like to start at the end. So in this case, the end of the project is pretty clear. We want to launch a podcast, and then we want to continue producing episodes after that.
Right.
So working backwards a step from that, we need to figure out how many episodes do you need or what comes right before it. And for most hosts, what I usually recommend about a week before is releasing a trailer just to build up a little bit of hype, kind of leading up to the launch. So now we know we need a few episodes. We need a trailer. Okay, let's go back a step before that. We now need all the things we talked about before when it comes to learning how to record, edit, and prep episodes. That would be the one step before. And then coming back to what is the very first thing you would do, of course, you need your concept. We know it's about gardening, but who is it for? Why are they tuning into this podcast? We need a little bit more clarity around the concept of the show, the name, the podcast artwork, all of that, the concept and branding we really want to get down. And then a very specific tip I would offer anybody thinking about starting a podcast is that I think it's really helpful to sit down for 5 or 10 minutes and just brainstorm as many episode ideas as you can. And there are many ways you can think of ideas, but if you sit down and you can't even think of 20 plus ideas, it's not that you have to do all of them, but if you can only think of 5, it's going to be an uphill battle, I think, to produce the whole show, whether it's that the topic's not broad enough, maybe your interest isn't deep enough, or your expertise might not be there. Any of those reasons, I think, could be a sign that either you just need to do more research. That's no problem. Look around, look at gardening blogs, see what people are asking about. That's perfectly fine. But sometimes I've found people don't quite have enough ideas. And so that's why I recommend just starting there and seeing, are you excited about these ideas on the paper? Does this sound like a podcast that you would want to get into? So those are some of the early steps for planning. And I would say overall, you're going to kind of break it into the planning phase, then the production phase, where you're starting to create those early episodes and get your editing and your recording systems in place. And then your promotion phase would be phase 3 to actually start sharing the podcast.
So how do you get over that learning curve? You know, you've done that, and now you're afraid to press record because you're like, how do I edit? How do I do this? You know, what are some suggestions to get over the learning curve and not use that as a procrastination tool for launching?
Such a great question, because I often get asked, how long does it take to launch a podcast? The answer is always, it depends. Most of my students launch between 30 and 90 days, I would say. But by far, the thing they spend the most time on is not learning how to edit. It's convincing themselves to press the record button. It's just starting. And I know how intimidating it is. Like, I think a lot of people are surprised to hear that I'm pretty introverted. I'm not shy by any means. And I was teaching in-person classes before I was podcasting. So I am more comfortable teaching and kind of getting on the mic. But hitting record and putting yourself out there, hearing the sound of your own voice for a lot of people is a huge hang up. Like, who is she? Why does my voice sound that way? It's just not something we're used to tuning into. But what I will say is that I think it's a huge myth that some people are just better at podcasting than others. If you look out there at your favorite show, I would say odds are good that this person has either been podcasting for a long time or they've been sharing information in some other way, in person or online. And so their comfort level could just be different than yours. And really the best way to get good at podcasting is to start doing it. So if you're terrified of hitting the record button, I often recommend that you just hit record and just start talking. You don't have to use that material. Just see if there's a way that you can kind of get your thoughts out. If you did prep an episode, record it, but go into it thinking, it's okay if I don't use this. I'm just here to kind of see what this is like, do some sound checks, see how I like it. And your first 5, probably 10 episodes won't sound quite the way that you want them to, because you know what a good podcast sounds like. We're all experts at listening and consuming entertainment and information, but that's just the gap between what you know good looks like and your starting skill level because you're a beginner. So I think that's something important to remember, is that podcasting is not necessarily so hard and so challenging that you could never do it. It's just that it's a new skill. So of course it feels challenging. Of course you're not good at it yet. So just kind of sit in being a little uncomfortable and release the first episodes anyway. Because if you wait until you feel like they're ready, you will never have a podcast.
What would you say is one of the like number one problems that first time podcasters have after launching their first, after finally hitting record? What would be that main problem that you see most podcasters fall into?
A lot of podcast hosts, unfortunately, fall into this category of, it's called pod fading, where you only make it to 3 to 7 episodes. In fact, earlier I said that there are about 2 million podcasts at the time of our recording. 44% of them have 3 episodes or fewer. So it could be that they're new. Yeah, it's a huge number. Most of them only made it to a trailer, or they only made it to a couple of episodes. And so the mistake I see a lot of hosts making is that they plan and they rush into the launch day because launching is so exciting, but they haven't thought about the week after. So my strong recommendation is, before you launch your podcast, you have the advantage of time, where even if you launch 1 week or 2 weeks later than you thought you wanted to, I think it's worth it to even record a couple more episodes so that starting on your launch day, you're not immediately back to the drawing board, starting a brand new episode. You have nothing to release the next week or even 2 weeks later if you're going bi-weekly. So just get a little bit of a bank going on of even a few recorded, maybe 1 edited, so that you're setting yourself up that if, let's say, your kid gets sick or your business is really busy or you just don't have the time 1 week, you don't immediately feel so overwhelmed by your show.
Right, because that's the thing when it comes to, it's just the timing. For many people that are starting a podcast, it's not like they're retired and have nothing to do, right?
No,
they have a family. Right, they have a job. So it's just the timing. So when you're getting ready to launch, what are some tips that you would give someone in reference to just creating that timeline to make you do it, to just get to it and not, push it off for weeks and weeks at a time, but making some time in your new schedule, because this is a new task. It's a new hobby. It's like if you have kids, and I'll give myself, for example, I have a senior, a new high school student, and then a toddler, right? And she's starting school. So the schedule has changed completely. How do you help someone kind of navigate through that routine and through that schedule? And I know there's no perfect way, but I would definitely love to hear some of your examples.
Yeah, I would say during the pre-launch window, it will take you longer to launch than you think. And it's not because launching a podcast has 3 months worth of work. It's just that, as you said before, we all have so many other things going on. So I would say, even in my courses, I recommend most students take a 60 or a 90-day launch, because then you can just focus on one thing at a time. 1 week is just about, let's make 1 great episode. Okay, then the next week, let's do a little bit of the branding of the show. The next week, okay, let's think about publishing. And just by keeping focused, I think it's a lot easier to stay motivated, because if you try to launch in, say, 30 days, and if you feel like you get a little behind, it's so demoralizing, and then you won't launch at all. And really, in the big scheme of life, who was coming after you to say if you didn't launch in September, you failed? I think we put these unrealistic timelines on ourselves where we get it in our head that, oh, wow, right now at the time of this recording, it's July. And wow, I really want to have this podcast live by August, by the time, back to school season comes around. And then once we get that in our head, for some reason, it starts to feel like a failure if we launch even a week later. I've had some students share that. And to me, the fact that you've launched it all puts you so far ahead of the pack of people who wish they had a podcast. So I would say always, this is a rule of thumb from project management, triple the time you think it'll take to do something. You think it'll take a month to launch a podcast? Do 3. You think it'll take you 1 hour to learn how to do something? This is even beyond podcasting. Assume it'll take you 3. This is a trick that worked really well for me when I was leading teams, and it works really well when I budget my own time now. And so that's the pre-launch tip. Multiply it all by 3.
Right.
And then
Okay.
when it comes to just week-to-week episode production, a few tips I could share about time management are, first of all, you don't have to do a weekly show. I think that's a big misconception too, where if you're going into it thinking, ooh, I already have a lot going on in my business, I already have a lot going on, even one a week feels not possible for me right now, start with every other week. You can always change the cadence of your show. Once you get into a rhythm, you can say, wow, I'm really liking this. I feel like I have momentum. Let's do every single week. You can also switch it to biweekly. If you say, I do want to give it a go, let's do a weekly show, feels overwhelming, you can always switch it. Nothing in podcasting is permanent. So that's a starting point. But then on top of that, I would say there are 2 strategies when it comes to producing regular content. One is if you want to do batch work, and the other is if you want to get into more of a weekly routine. So a weekly routine to me is something like, let's say your podcast comes out on a Tuesday. So to do Tuesday, your episode comes out. Then on Thursday, let's say you always prep your episode, you record it on Thursdays, you edit on Fridays, and then you prep everything for publish on Mondays. And that could work for you. Or it could be that Thursday is podcast day. And you just know every single Thursday, you're going to sit down, you're going to do one full episode, the entire thing from start to finish, and that works for you. The other thing that some people like to do is called batching. A lot of people apply it to different parts of their business. So batching means that you do a lot of the same task at one time. So maybe the first week of every month, you record all of your episodes. If you're interviewing guests, maybe you always schedule interviews only during the first week of the month, and you don't do anything else for your podcast. It's just recording. Then maybe the next week you're editing or you're outsourcing if editing is not your thing. Then you're working on all of the marketing material and publishing, and then episodes start to go live, and then the cycle repeats every month. So I think that either strategy can work. The benefits of batch working is that you can really get in the zone. Like for me, writing 4 episodes worth of show titles and descriptions, I get it done way faster. And I feel similarly about social media. Like batching a full month's worth of Instagram content, let's say, in one sitting, I feel so much more productive. It takes me way less time than if I tried to do one post at a time throughout the month. So batching has been a huge help for my business. But do you have any tips too? I'm curious what you do.
Yeah, so I'm batching. I'm just like you as far as when it comes to podcasting and YouTube. I will shoot 3 videos for YouTube in one day, 3 podcasts in one day, and then the rest of the time I don't have to worry about it. At this point, it's more of creating the schedule for the month of when it launches, the promotion, that type of thing. But to weekly shoot a podcast it gets difficult. And then I do find that as I'm going through my podcast, the second one sounds even stronger. You know, the third, because you can tell I'm in my zone at this point. I got a flow going. And so that's why I prefer batching.
Yeah, that's so smart. And I like to, you mentioned about like batching. I think the precursor to that is also the planning. So even if it's setting a monthly, let's say a calendar event, or for me, I use Asana for project management. I have a recurring monthly task where I take a look at the next month's calendar to see if the topics I've picked are still the ones that I want to focus on. I usually do quarterly planning, and then every month I kind of check and see, okay, I still like what I've got for August. Those are the 4 I want to go with. But just having that moment of checking in monthly, even looking at, let's say, your podcast stats monthly, I like to do just a little bit of a bigger picture moment each month. And I set it up as a recurring alert so that I don't forget to do it.
So I'm glad you said that. Before we get into the actual generating funds off of a small podcast, I wanted to get into a little bit more of it's being okay to change your schedule. It's to change what your content is for the month of August or for September. So although you may plan out for so long, you know, like you said, it's a misconception where we get in our heads where we're like, well, we know this is supposed to be launching. I'm supposed to be talking about XYZ topic, but for some odd reason, that's not the route I want to go. It's not falling in a line with what I'm doing. You know, what are some tips to get out of your own head and just say, just change it. It is okay.
It's hard. I think that one of the things that's helped me a lot is I had a background working in live corporate events. And when you're producing an event for, say, 10,000 people, even the best planning, something will always break. Yeah. And so by working in an industry like that, you don't go into it with the mentality of, how can I make sure nothing breaks? Instead, you just go into it assuming something will not go to plan. And then you're just flexible on the job. And I think that that's a learned skill. And with podcasting and online business especially, I think it's smart to have a plan because it gives you direction. But I think if your mentality around the plan is, this is the starting point, this is what I think we're going to do. But if you don't give, I think, the pressure onto yourself to say it has to be this, then you'll find more success. Even as an example in my own business, Apple and Spotify in the year 2021 have gone absolutely nuts, releasing updates, changing everything. They've been doing so much. And so I had to change a lot of the episodes that I planned to release to accommodate for those industry updates. And because I was kind of open-minded about just knowing this was the most important content my audience needed to hear, you can pivot. And then you just say, oh, well, I had an episode prepped. It'll just go live the next week.
Right.
And then you're just a little bit ahead. You're a little stressed in the moment, but then you're a little bit ahead. So I think just kind of giving yourself permission when you make the plan to not say, if I don't do this plan, I have failed. And instead just seeing it as a blueprint, as a starting point. I think it's a lot healthier. And then just go into any project knowing that it could change and probably a few things will break. A few things will not go according to plan. And if you go into it with that expectation, then when the inevitable happens, you're mentally prepared for it.
Right. Yeah. And I'm glad you said it because I like to use that transparency where everyone thinks that everything's just perfect. It's amazing how everything happens and it should just go to flow. But I like to use the transparency as, oh, this broke today. So we have to change a little bit. And I think it allows you to relate a little bit more to your audience, to your fan base, when you are open with, hey, we weren't able to learn. We're not perfect, and based on some of the feedback that we've gotten, we're pivoting in this space. So I think that allows you to open up that transparency to provide that trust from your listeners, from your audience.
That's so smart. I love that you said that it provides trust to your audience because I think it's so true. Like people don't need you to be perfect and to get everything right the first try. But if you're open with them and you share what happened, I do think that makes you a human to them. And people like to buy from humans that they really like. So I think that's really great.
Right. Yesterday I was teaching a class with young people and marketing class, and they were using TikTok. And so I let them do their own commercial. They're selling this one ink pen, a refillable pen for $20. That was like the behind the scenes that they had to do an ad for. And so they all did these ads and they shared in one group one. And I was like, so what about this ad made you like it? They're like, well, they were honest. They said, this is horrible marketing, which it was. And they're like, it's just a Tuesday and this is a great pen. Buy it. And I'm like, and that's what made you purchase the pen? They're like, yeah, they didn't know what to say. And they were honest about it. I'm like, kids are even looking for that transparency. And so when I asked the question of why, and they're like, so many people now are just selling stuff because of their name, their influence. Like, we don't just want to buy it from them, like, because they probably don't even use it. We just really want something that is like authentic. And I'm like, wow, like for young people that are looking to purchase, they're looking for that same thing, that trust. They don't want that pre-polished, made up stuff. They want you to be your natural human self.
That's so smart. And I think authenticity is a word that people talk about a lot, but it's hard to understand what it means because when you look out online, I think too often you see everyone who looks the same, whether it's literally the person or just the strategies that they're using. I think it's easy to fall into this trap of, oh, everyone is trying this strategy. That means I should do it. Right. And I think you'll know as a podcaster, as a business owner, if something feels right to you or if it doesn't. I think that your gut on what suits your brand, your personality, and what is right is something that you can trust. And so I think in this case, like I'm totally with you, like being transparent and just telling people like, hey, that didn't work. Like, let's try it again. Like that's how I am. And not dancing around on TikTok is also who I am. And there's no shade on other people who do that because for some of them, that's authentic.
That's their thing, right?
Yeah. But for you, just kind of know, like, if it feels good, you'll know. And if it doesn't, I think you'll figure that out pretty fast too.
All right. So let's shift gears a little bit. For those that have started their podcast or a small podcasting group, but they're looking to learn how to generate income. How do they do that with not such a large audience?
So historically, when people talk about earning money as a podcast host, they are all looking at the sponsorship model. And that's what a lot of people still actually do. Ask me directly. They'll say, Melissa, I want to earn money podcasting. How do I book sponsors? They just jump right from point A to point B. And I think the reason why is because when we look at some of our bigger favorite shows, of course they have sponsors. They're big names. Right. They're on networks. They've got celebrities. They're a totally different ballgame. But I think for a lot of newer hosts and also podcasts like ours, like we're business owners. We have this as a part of our brand. we're not necessarily ever going to be the top podcast on Apple. But I think that's okay because we're going to be the number one podcast for our exact ideal listener. And so what your perfect listener wants and needs is the service that you probably already offer. It's whatever your business is doing. And it's funny because so many hosts are focused on building up a big enough audience so that they can one day pitch sponsors. When in fact, even if you have 50 people tuning in every week, if you imagine that in person, that's a huge group. That's 50 people coming for you every single week in person. And we're so afraid for some reason to tell them about our own business and what we do. And one service package or one online course could be anywhere from, I would say, $50, $5,000, you never know. But you really only need one of those people to purchase. And podcast listeners, in my experience, are some of the absolute hottest leads in my business because they're tuning in even 30 minutes of their time, an hour of their time. There's hardly any other medium right now where you have somebody's undivided attention for that long.
Right.
You could watch a reel for 10 seconds and be bored by the end. Some of them are great, but that attention span is so short. And so when it comes to podcasting, I know earlier we were talking about getting in the routine and the time management of producing an episode. But when I think about the return on the few hours I've spent on one episode, let's say, it'll last for months and months. People will find it a full year later and then still reach out to me and book a call or enroll in one of my courses. And so to me, the time spent on that pays for itself in the long run, time and time again. So I think for anybody with a business or an aspiring business owner as well, just using your podcast as a platform to promote your own business, your own products and services is by far a more lucrative approach. And I do want to say it doesn't mean treat it as an infomercial. Doesn't mean the whole thing is just a big giant pitch. You can still use, I've seen some hosts use it as an ad. So the difference between an ad and a sponsor is that the ad is just a 30-ish second spot on your show where you promote something. But a sponsor is somebody external from your business who pays you for the right to have an ad on your show. So you can have an ad for your own business. You can say this podcast is sponsored by my business name here, and here's what we do. And to learn more or book a free call, go to this URL. And so you can put that at the start or the end of the episode. And now you've told people exactly what your business does. And if by the end of the episode, it makes sense for them to book a call with you, then they know exactly where to go.
So their CTA should not be, like you said, the sales pitchy. And I think that's what happens when we get on. I've heard different, like new podcasters I've heard, and it sounds like from the moment they get on throughout the entire show, it's just like sales, sales, sales. So it takes away from the content that they're actually delivering. So we don't really get an idea of the content. Would you suggest or advise that maybe, pushing to a Facebook group, or would you go to a website? Like when they do their CTA, where should they drive their traffic?
Yeah, I think you can mix it up. What I usually say is that I don't recommend having more than one per episode, but you could try something different in different episodes. So let's say for one, you have a free Facebook group. And so maybe at the very start or in the outro, you could do one place or both. You spend no more than 30 seconds saying, I have this group. If this is who you are and this is the kind of support and community you're looking for, go to this URL. And then after you give that 30-second spot, you are done talking about the offer. To me, that's the bigger mistake I see people making, is that they just go on for way too long about the pitch. It's better to have a really short to the point pitch that tells people exactly what it is and exactly where they can get it, and then go right back into content mode, value mode, instead of what I see people doing, especially at the start, is they'll go on for 2 to 5 minutes about the workshop they have coming up. And let me tell you, I said earlier, people have a longer attention span for podcasts, but if you don't hook them within the first minute, they will not make it to the 15th minute. So you really have to use that first real estate wisely. And I would say within the first 2 minutes of each episode, people should know what they're getting. You shouldn't give it all away. I often say you should give them the promise, but not the process. So tell them, I have 5 tips for, keeping weeds out of your garden. I know nothing about gardening. My uncle, who was a pro, if he heard this, he'd be like,
I was going to ask you.
I know nothing. I have a black thumb. I am the opposite of a green thumb. All my plants are dead. But I was talking with somebody about it earlier this week. So with gardening, if that was the hook of the episode, people should know that you're going to cover it. You're going to offer some tools. You're going to share your favorite tips. You're going to share the number one thing most people are doing wrong. You're going to market that episode in the first couple of minutes. But you're not going to tell them, oh, by the way, I'm going to tell you all about it, and here's my favorite thing. because then they'll just leave. So if you waste that real estate on only the CTA, I think that's a huge mistake. So keep it to 30 seconds. One episode, do the free Facebook group. Another one, say you want to book a call with you to learn more about your services. Another one, maybe you have a freebie. This will depend on your business entirely.
Right.
But the mistake I see in the outro is that people list them all. They'll say, thank you for tuning in. Subscribe to my podcast. And I have a workshop. And I have services. And I have a Facebook group. And follow me on TikTok. And do all these things. And if you give people a laundry list, they won't do a single thing. So just keep it to the single CTA. You can, of course, still encourage people to subscribe to your show. Like you can say that every episode. But if you have something that's dedicated, like the Facebook group or an offer, just stick to one per episode.
So do you suggest the subscriptions to podcasts pretty much where you give them an opportunity to subscribe to your show, or just kind of leave it open and organic where they're just on the directories?
Now you say subscribe or follow because in Apple, subscribe now means that they're paying for the podcast, while follow means that they are tuned in as a free subscriber. With that, though, I don't believe you need to list out and say, like, we're on Apple, we're on Spotify, we're on Stitcher, we're on Overcast. People in 2021, if they're listening to your podcast and they have made it to the end, they have found a way to listen to your podcast. Like they have figured it out. So I usually just say, something like, thank you so much for tuning in. If you haven't already, I recommend following or subscribing to the show so you receive an alert right when we release new episodes. Then I give my CTA. Like I just keep it so fast, under a few seconds. It's why YouTubers for ages have always said, subscribe to the channel. It starts to feel repetitive if you are a longtime, very avid YouTube listener or you're a very dedicated podcast listener. But especially with podcasting, you will probably be somebody's first podcast. And so I always give the advice that your episode, each one, will probably be somebody's first ever podcast episode, or definitely the first episode they ever tune in to you. So whether it's episode 1, episode 27, that's somebody's first impression. And so every time somebody will not already be subscribed. So I don't think it's redundant to just give a quick little nod every episode.
So should you be on multiple directories or should you stick to just one?
You should be in all of them because there's no harm in being everywhere. I think a misconception about directories is that you would need to give your episode to Apple separately from giving your episode to Spotify, separately from giving your episode to Overcast. But what you actually do instead is you'll use a tool called your podcast hosting platform. We talked about it briefly earlier. And all of your episodes go into what's called an RSS feed. This is the techie part that most people start to eyes glaze over. I promise you don't need any coding to be a podcaster. It just means that all of your data, all of your info, your podcast name, your artwork, your episodes, they're all being stored together in a digital file. That's really what the RSS feed is. And then when you give that URL just one time to Apple, just one time to Spotify, then anytime in the future, when you add more information to that file, it appears in all of the directories. So I recommend being everywhere. Certainly Apple, Google, Spotify, and now Amazon are the kind of must-haves. But even there are some longer-term. Stitcher is something that a lot of longtime podcast listeners use. Overcast. I mean, if I was here listing all the apps, we would have a full hour-long episode. There are truly dozens of them these days. But as long as you're in those main apps, some of them, the smaller directories, they just look at Apple and they show all podcasts that are in Apple. So you'll show up in a lot more places than you think that you will. But yeah, Apple, Google, and Spotify, and I would say now Amazon as well, are the primary places to submit yourself.
All right. So now you've launched your podcast. You finally pushed record. You have some listeners, and you're starting to notice you have a few haters. You have a few people that are giving you negative combat because every day cannot be a best happy-go-lucky day when you put your podcast out. How do you deal with negative comments or listeners and just responding to them?
It's hard because even when you're starting out, you will have a couple of people who it is not about you. Like it's about them and who they are, that they have these negative energies to put out into the world. And so it's kind of case by case about what you want to do. But I would say just kind of keep it either polite or ignore it. Definitely don't hesitate to make those kinds of decisions because those people are not serving you. And it's no skin off your back if they can no longer see your Instagram page. Remind yourself that it's not really about you. You can't let them get to you. You can't let one negative comment prevent you from helping the 100 other people who didn't say anything but appreciate you. So the negative voices will always be the loudest. And I think You just have to kind of continue practicing like mental resilience to remind yourself that they're the loudest, but that they're the least important.
And I sometimes feel like the negativity, it just lets you know you're moving in a good space. Because when people start nitpicking everything you say, well, at least you're listening to what I'm saying. And it just, for me, it validates, well, I'm moving in the right direction. They wouldn't have taken the time if they didn't want to kind of damage my spirit. So I'm just going to keep on pushing. You know, and I used to highlight my ranters, shall we say, and it kind of slowed down. I guess it made people be like, well, I don't want her to highlight me. So we're not going to talk about it. So I like to ask about, you know, I get asked this question a lot, and I'm fairly new to podcasting in reference to my business is concerned. I used to do radio, and radio and podcasting are two different things. So how do you go about getting more listeners when you know what you're talking about, you know your audience, you've just been sharing typically now on your Facebook page, or maybe, you know, sharing little things on Instagram. How do you go about captivating more listeners as you're building your podcast?
Yeah, I had never really thought about that specific difference between radio and podcasting. Radio, it almost has like a built-in audience, or if you're the host of a show, that's not necessarily your responsibility to find listeners. You
just come on and you talk and have a good time, and then you're like, goodbye.
Done for the day.
Yeah.
That's a good point. It sounds so obvious when you say it, but that's so true. But with podcasting, it is, of course, like the $1 million question, right? The two questions I get all the time are, what microphone do you recommend, and how do I get more podcast listeners?
Yeah.
I would say there's two distinct types of marketing channels that I think are important to understand, not even just as a podcast host, but as a business owner. So there's one bucket called owned media, and there's another called earned media. There's also technically referrals, word of mouth, people talking about you. And I think the only way really to address that bucket is to put out great content and to be helpful and just to serve people. So that bucket should grow on its own if you're being authentic and doing all the things we've been talking about. So let's focus on the other two. Owned media is anywhere that you have either a site or a profile or somewhere that you can manage the content. So your website is a big example of owned media. Your podcast, your YouTube channel, your social media profiles, anywhere that you are putting out content is called owned media. And that is, of course, hugely important. And for a lot of business owners, maybe as you're tuning in, you can ask yourself, am I only focusing on owned media? Because on the other hand, earned media is when you put yourself in front of somebody else's audience. It's going on a podcast. It's being a virtual summit speaker or an in-person speaker. It's guest blogging. It's doing collaborations on Clubhouse or TikTok or Instagram or Facebook Lives in other people's groups. Just any place where you can put yourself in front of somebody's audience is called earned media. And for most podcast hosts, especially when they're getting started, when I ask them about their marketing mix, they only give me owned media. They only give me the places on the internet where they're releasing content. And those are important because it is such a valuable way to build relationships with people. And definitely with social media, there's a bit of crossover because, you know, we all love to talk about algorithms and growth. You absolutely can find new people through social media, especially if it's the current darling, like a Clubhouse or a TikTok.
Right.
There's growth to be had there. But I think the mistake I see is that people don't focus on putting themselves in front of new audiences to bring them back to your owned media. Like if you imagined a funnel, I would say the top of the funnel are just people on the internet. They don't know about you yet. And what you can do is go in front of those other audiences to get top of funnel with somebody who's a perfect fit, who would like your podcast, who would like to become maybe an eventual client or a student for you. And so then you bring them back to your podcast. Now they're in your world. They're in your owned media. They're engaging with you on social. They're on your email list. They're listening to your podcast. And that group is warm. And then eventually, hopefully, some of them will convert in the bottom of the funnel and they will become buyers. But I think if you're only doing those bottom two and you're not focusing on the new leads, that's where most people go wrong.
I agree in that aspect is that I notice people, especially when I work with some certain business owners, they're just deciding to take the leap. And what I do, I pretty much help those take their industry expertise and they package it. They package it into, it could be a course, it could be a podcast, however, but they're afraid to actually share it to the world. They're like, why share it on my Facebook page? And it's like, your Facebook page, that's your warm market. Those people know you. They're probably not trying to buy what you're selling. So you have to get in front of other people. And they're like, oh, I just don't know if I could do that. I'm like, well, how do you want people to find you if you're not open to sharing? You know what I mean? So lastly, that goes in, this is my last question before I ask the question of, decisions in our life. You give us some good advice for those that are looking to launch their own business, looking to launch their podcast. So I'm going to give you a little moment to think about that while I'm closing up the directories as far as marketing your podcast and getting out in front of other people. When you're inside of different groups, and some groups allow you to share and some groups are just spammy groups, what is a suggestion as far as using those different groups if you're on Facebook or if you're on I say Quora, asking questions, things like that, to use those to your advantage and reference to your business? What are some things that you could do to help create you as the expert, to where people are not just dropping links, but you're actually providing impact and advice and content inside of those groups?
Yeah. Earlier, we talked about how the students you were working with in the marketing example, they could just tell bad marketing from a mile away. And people know when they're being sold to. But ultimately, your business solves somebody's problem. So if you can prove to them that you are knowledgeable and legitimately helpful, that'll build way more trust than just dropping a link ever could. So if somebody asks a question, like some good examples from my business is that I'm in, of course, groups with podcasters. And so I do see people asking about what's my, what hosting platform do you use? Or what tips do you have about this? So if I have a blog post about some of those tools in a roundup, I'll put that there because it answers their question directly. It is the exact thing they were asking for. Other times, though, people will just be asking more broadly, like about launching a podcast or about growing a podcast. And if I were to just slide in and say, oh, I have a course, I haven't built up that relationship for them to have any trust in me. So that's a good example where instead I would probably offer some tips to say, oh, when I help my students launch podcasts, here are some of my favorite tips, or just do something that is not a novel. You don't have to waste your whole day just in these groups because you could. They're rabbit holes. But just giving something that's valuable and short, a quick win, or just something that's often missed, I think is really useful. And no matter where you are, I think whether it's Facebook, Reddit, any of these forums, they can click on your name. Like they know where to find you.
Right.
So when I see people who share something so valuable in these groups, that's the first thing I do. I click on their name, I figure out what their business is, and then I go over there and stalk them for myself. So if you can be useful, people will find you. So I would say, don't be afraid to share value. If it happens to link them back to your site, that's great. But unless they're asking directly about a service or a service provider, I would probably err on the side of not giving that unless asked.
So we're going to wrap up here. And before we do, I just want to say we've all definitely, faced major decisions in our lives. We've all had different challenges and obstacles, but what was that pivotal moment in your space, in your life that made you take your journey seriously and really just focus on your business and podcasting and where you want it to go?
It's tough because I think there are several. And that's probably true for a lot of people where I have this role where I work in podcasting. This is something that didn't even exist when I was in college. Nobody was studying to be a podcast producer. It just was not a thing. And so if I had tried to figure everything out even 5 years ago, I could never have seen the business that I have today. So I would say there was a pivotal moment where I was working at General Assembly and I was teaching in-person Excel classes. And after some of my classes, people would ask me if I tutored. They asked me if I did business consulting. And in every case, even if I had never done it before, I just said, yes, I do. Let me get back to you with my rates. I took their email address, I went home, I Googled rates, and then I sent them a proposal. I was not in a formal business at all. But you start to realize that if you provide value, if you are a good teacher, if you are a great service provider, if you are a skilled freelancer, if you have any skills worth sharing, and I promise that you do, people will seek you out. They'll start to ask you, hey, do you do this? Hey, can I pay you for that? And so I would say just starting to pay attention to what some of those were was a huge help. People wanted my help with Excel and all that nerdy stuff that I love to do in spreadsheets. They wanted my help when they saw me producing podcasts and the fact that I just had these systems down and I wasn't feeling overwhelmed, and they enjoyed my shows. So I started getting questions about podcasting. I also get a ton of questions about online course creation because of my experience working at Teachable with Ramit, and my own students see my course and they ask, wow, like, how did you do this? How did you have this experience? And so just paying attention to those moments, I think, has been really crucial. And at the same time, not feeling like you have to do it all at once. Like, I think it's okay to say yes to something in the moment, even if it doesn't have a 5-year business plan. Like, I did not have a 5-year plan of building up a huge Excel tutoring agency, but I saw an opportunity to help a few students who I really liked and to make a little bit more money and just to see where it went. So not everything that you do needs to have, I think, a huge long-term plan. I think it's useful to know, what are you doing in a specific direction? For me, the direction was run my own business, help women who have their own online businesses. And to me, as long as I'm moving in that direction, the specific ways that I help have the flexibility to change and evolve over time. And I think all of us are not necessarily just one thing. So I would say you can either find one skill or thing that you're passionate about, or one person that you're really passionate about serving. And those were just a few, I think, pivotal decisions I made along the way.
That is perfect. That is the perfect segue to closing this show, because we definitely told people to hone in. We call it your GVP, your greatest valuable proficiency. And that is just breaking down what you're proficient at, what you don't have to think about. You just know it, and hone in on that skill, especially if it's something you're passionate about, and turn that into your industry expertise, into your business. So thank you so much, Melissa. You have provided great, when I tell you, amazing feedback in reference to starting a podcast, as I've been getting questions about, how to start a podcast. Should I use it for my business? And I'm like, let's see. Let me seek out an expert that can answer some of those questions for you. So I totally appreciate that. So if anybody was interested in working with you and getting some more hands-on one-on-one time with you, how could they do that?
I would say the best way to learn more about my whole process around starting a podcast, the mistakes I see people making, and my philosophies around simplifying and thinking long-term about podcasting, I do have a free masterclass called How to Launch a Podcast in 60 Days Without Feeling Overwhelmed. And you can save your spot for free at witandwire.com/PWEP for Professional Women's Escape Plan.